Nice to see everybody. We got a good topic today. I think this is a pretty hot topic for lots of people, especially in the endurance crowd. It's kind of one of those things that gets a lot of buzz, like using fat as fuel. And I think people don't necessarily really understand what that actually means and how the body actually works. Am I frozen here? I'm just going to give it a sec. Is that better? Can you guys hear me now?
Yep, everything's good.
Everything's good.
Okay. Sorry, I'll just kind of go back to where I was. We just had a guy actually join our thing here. He's like an old friend. I can't believe this is actually him jumping on the call. Hey, Grant, are you there? Maybe not. Anyway, if he pops on, I might say a quick hi because it's a guy I haven't seen in a really long time. Anyway, so as I was saying, using fat as a fuel sort of gets a lot of buzz, but I don't necessarily think people really understand what that means. And I don't think they really understand like what fuel sources we have available to us and how we use them and kind of when they're important. So what we're going to do today is just kind of go through a general overview of the different fuel sources that we can use when we're training and racing. And then at the end, kind of get specific on a few different ways that you can actually encourage your body to utilize fat as its primary fuel source. But I think as we go through this, you'll start to understand that is useful in one capacity, but our ability to utilize carbohydrate is also very useful. It's not like we want only one and not the other. It kind of depends on what you're doing. So it's pretty important distinction. So I'm just going to throw up a little slideshow here. And also at any point during this, just please jump in with questions if you have them. This is pretty casual. We got a pretty small group, so it should be pretty easy. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen here. So can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So fat as fuel. So how to improve your ability to use fat as fuel. Let's first sort of identify what fuel sources we have available to us as human beings. So the first one, and probably the one that is most most talked about and most utilized is carbohydrate. And I say utilized because, most of the nutrition products you're going to buy off the shelf are carbohydrate focused and carbohydrate based. And there's a reason for that. So basically carbohydrate is one of the main ones. We get about 4 calories, like basically units of energy per gram of carbohydrate. And as intensity increases, we lean more and more on carbohydrate as our fuel source. We can also use fat. Fat has more energy per gram than carbohydrate does. It has about 9 calories per gram. And it's more important at lower intensities. So when we're not going as hard, our body will utilize fat more readily than it will when we're going harder. And if you think of things in extremes, it's maybe the easiest way to think about it. So when you're sleeping and your intensity is pretty much as low as it gets as a human being, you're basically utilizing fat as the primary fuel source, right? That's why you can go to bed and wake up 8 hours later and not bonk, right? You're not out of glycogen stores because your body is utilizing fat as its primary fuel source. And then protein is also a fuel source that we can use. It's less relevant for what we're going to talk about, so I'm not really going to talk about it much today. But it does become important in the latter stages of a long endurance event if your glycogen stores really fall off the map. And then in extreme cases of like real starvation, we will break down muscle and utilize protein. But that's not a good thing. So we're not going to talk much about that because I want to keep it sport specific. Okay, so how it works, real quick overview here. Adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, which is probably what you've heard of, is the primary energy unit that the body uses for muscle contraction. So when we break down food, or we break down a fuel source like carbohydrate, fat, or protein, what we're really after is ATP. We want those units of energy because they help our muscles contract. So that's what we're after. So fat, carbohydrate, and protein, they're all the fuel sources that the body uses to get that. When intensity is low, we lean more heavily on fat as the way to get that. And when intensity increases, we shift more to carbohydrate. So that's, pretty simple, but still good to know. So the pros of using fat as fuel, fat has the greatest amount of stored energy of all our available fuel sources. So about 9 calories per gram. Fat is stored in abundance in our body. So even if you're a really lean athlete, like, we still have enough fat stores to really do a lot of work. I don't know if this is 100% true. I might want to dig a little bit more, but my understanding is that we have about enough fat on our bodies to do 10 Ironmans back to back. Like, if the energy cost is whatever that is, we have enough fat on our bodies to just keep doing them. Fat is not really a limiter for anybody. It's muscle glycogen and carbohydrate that becomes the limiter, and we'll get into that in a sec. So we have lots of stored fat on our bodies, even really lean runners do. So so fat is used readily when intensity is low, optimally around or below about 65% of our aerobic capacity. So we'll get into some threshold stuff later on, but really your utilization of fat versus carbohydrate is mostly dependent on how hard you're going. So fat, another big pro is that it will spare your muscle glycogen. So by that meaning, if you're using fat as the fuel, you're not going to pull as much carbohydrate. And the reason that's important is because we only have a certain amount of stored muscle glycogen. So we typically have about, they used to say about an hour. It's probably maybe 90 minutes to 2 hours worth of stored muscle glycogen. But really, it depends how hard you're going, because the harder you go, the more you're going to require muscle glycogen, and the quicker you're going to run out. So really, it's not a fixed number. It kind of depends on how hard you're going. And that is important because when you run out of muscle glycogen, I'm sure we've all experienced that, you bonk, which is that horrific feeling of, like, this is when you go, if you bonk and you end up at home, this is when you eat 2 bags of chips and a bag of gummy worms, and you just cannot consume enough because it's just like a horrible feeling to have. So when our intensity is appropriate, or if we're doing something long and we're pulling more from fat as a fuel, then we will, of course, use less of our stored muscle glycogen. And another benefit actually is that it makes it easier to replace the muscle glycogen that we're losing because we don't have to eat as much. So by leaning more on fat as a fuel over the long haul, we can effectively keep up with the loss of glycogen stores. So like if you're going to do an Ironman, for example, or a marathon even, if your intensity is appropriate and you're using fat, a higher percentage of fat, you're still burning carbohydrate, but you're not burning as much. So then when you take in a gel or you take in a sports drink, like you're maybe keeping up with the loss of carbohydrate. So then you can keep going effectively. That make sense? Yep. So the cons of fat, well, fat is not as useful for high intensity work. In fact, the higher the intensity you're going, the less percentage of fat you're going to use. And at very high intensities, you don't really use any. It's not very quick for us to access. Like we if you're going to be a high intensity athlete, you actually want to be able to utilize carbohydrate more readily. And we'll get into that a little bit later. So, if you're doing, work at your FTP or threshold, or you're sprinting for the line in a group ride, this is not where fat comes into play. It's kind of useless to you. You need to be able to use carbohydrate. So it has its limitations. And we still need carbohydrate to utilize fat. So there's an expression that fat burns in a carbohydrate flame. So it's not like we exclusively go to fat. Like, we still need a little bit of carbohydrate to make that happen. So the pros of carbohydrate, and again, this talk is about how to utilize more fat. I don't want you to take this as, oh, okay, I never need carbohydrate. That is not true. That is absolutely not the case. As an endurance athlete, like, we always are utilizing and need carbohydrate to do the work. The goal here is to teach you a few ways to just lean a little bit more on fat, because we have lots of it and it has tons of energy, right? And we're not really going to run out unless we do 10 Ironmans in a row, or we don't eat for 2 weeks, right? Then yes, of course, you're going to eventually tap out those stores. But anyway, so the pros of carbohydrate. Carbohydrate is readily used by the body, especially as intensity increases. And carbohydrate can be consumed on the go, which means you can limit the loss over time. So not as easy to sort of like consume fat during an Ironman and expect to be able to get that fat back. Whereas if you take in a sports drink, like, your body will use that. And so carbohydrate is just a quicker fuel. It's like putting fuel in your gas tank. You can use that fuel right away. The cons of carbohydrate, well, it contains less energy per gram than fat. It's stored in limited amounts in the body, so we don't have as much of it as we do fat. When we run out of muscle glycogen, we bonk, and I'm sure everybody on this call has experienced that. Carbohydrate can be hard to replace as intensity goes up, or if athletes have sensitive digestive systems. So probably somebody on this call or watching has some issues with their nutrition intake in races, and that's always a bit of a puzzle, is trying to figure out what works for you and what you can take in. So not only are we limited, like carbohydrate, we have a finite amount that we have access to, but also the consumption of it can be quite hard for people. Figuring out what products are going to work for you, figuring out what concentrations those need to be at, that can be a bit of a challenge. And then the other big thing that people often don't talk about is that when we combust carbohydrate in our bodies, like when we grab hold of it and use it to get that ATP, one of the byproducts is lactic acid. So the more carbohydrate we use, the more lactic acid we're going to produce. And again, if you just think about your own training, totally makes sense, right? Like if the intensity is high, so let's say you're doing short, hard hill repeats, biking or running, your body, fills up with lactic acid. Doesn't fill up, but you produce lactic acid. And the reason that's happening is because when the intensity is high, you need to grab hold of carbohydrate as your fuel source. And when you break that down to get your energy molecules, then lactic acid is one of the byproducts. Okay, so that's a limitation. Eventually, our bodies, if there's too much lactic acid in our bodies, then we just eventually have to stop and let the system recover, right? So real quick, I guess biochemistry lesson. I guess this would fit into biochemistry. But basically, when glucose is broken down, you can see the first little bit there, or the second little bit, we get our ATP, which is what we need. And then we get pyruvate, which then breaks down into lactic acid. Now, interestingly, you'll see, which is really cool, is that lactate can actually go back up the chain and turn back into lactic acid, or turn back into glucose or glycogen. So we can actually reutilize lactate, but not for very long. Eventually, we produce so much of it, it's limited by this thing called pyruvate. And when we run out of pyruvate, then we can't make that happen anymore. So I'll maybe get into that a little bit, but you don't really need to worry too much about that. The point here is to show you that, when we use glucose or glycogen or carbohydrate, I'm kind of saying the same thing with all of them. They're not the same thing, but anyway, when we use those, we get lactic acid, and that can be a limiter. So understanding thresholds and their relationship to fuel usage. So when we're measuring thresholds, we typically identify the first ventilatory threshold or the aerobic threshold as the point where we start leaning on carbohydrate more than we lean on fat. So if you've ever been to a lab and they've measured you've collected oxygen, there'll be a point where they identify like a first threshold or aerobic threshold. They're kind of all talking about the same thing. It typically happens around 65% of your aerobic capacity, so about 65% of perceived effort, let's say. When we go past that threshold, the body still uses fat, but now it's starting to lean a little bit more on carbohydrate. And this is why intensity is so important for something like Ironman or any really long event, is because we want to hang out more around that threshold so that we're utilizing fat as much as we possibly can, because it has tons of energy and will spare our glycogen reserve. We'll spare our carbohydrate reserves. When the intensity is low, we burn a higher percentage of fat, but we still need carbohydrate. I kind of covered that. As intensity increases, we still burn fat, but the percentage of what we burn leans more towards carbohydrate. So that's also an important thing to understand, is it's not like when we go past that first threshold, we just stop using fat. That's not what happens. We still burn fat. We just have to now utilize carbohydrate a little more readily. However, when intensity gets really high, then yeah, we're not really using fat anymore. But it's kind of like a sliding scale. It moves around. Okay, next. So I'm gonna share a different little thing here. So one of the things that we have now is this inside testing. So I think Rena's done it. I'm not sure who else has done it, but I'm gonna take you through the results you get, because one of the neat things we have now is, because we have so much data from over the years. So we have tons of like power data from athletes, cyclists, triathletes. And we have really clever algorithms now that can kind of figure it out. We can run tests now that actually give us really, really specific results around, how much fat we're using at specific intensities. So I'm just gonna, and I think that's gonna help your understanding of this a little bit more. So let's see here. Oh, actually, I could have just done. I think I can just do this. Yeah, so this is a sample test result. So this thing here, can everybody see this? Yeah? Is it clear, or is it clear enough, or is it pretty small? Anyway, this thing here called VLA max is a number that basically tells us how quickly our bodies go to carbohydrate as a fuel. And depending on how you're trained and the type of training you've done, this number here is actually very movable. Meaning, like if you are Jan Frodeno or Daniela Ryf, like the two that basically have won Kona the most in the last few years, I would suspect that this number for them will be very low, this thing called VLA max. And all that's telling us is that their bodies don't very quickly go to carbohydrate as a fuel. They're very efficient fat burners, or they utilize fat more readily than carbohydrate. So their number would be quite low. Now, on the other side of that, let's say you're a track cyclist or an 800-meter runner. We actually don't want this number to be very low. We don't want you to lean on fat as fuel as much. We want you to be able to grab hold of carbohydrate because it's a fast fuel. It like, you know, if you're going to be a sprinter or even like one of those mid-distance athletes where, let's say your event is, I don't know, 1 to 3 minutes, like that is a very carbohydrate heavy intensity. Like we want you to be using carbohydrate because it's faster fuel. We don't necessarily want you like going to fat as your fuel source because it's not as fast. So, you know, you would expect if you had, say, an Olympic track cyclist or even maybe a Tour de France rider that's trying to win the stages on their sprinting ability, this VLA max number might actually be quite high. Okay, so that's, again, our ability to grab hold of carbohydrate quickly and use it as fuel. So most of the people on this session today are probably doing half Ironman, marathons, that kind of thing. So we would want this to be a bit lower. We would want you to not go to carbohydrate as quickly as your fuel source. And then to put it right up the middle, let's say you're a crit rider. So if you don't know what that is, it's basically like usually crits in a bike is a type of bike race where you go around a circuit a whole bunch of times for maybe an hour. And sometimes your wattage is going to be really high because you're trying to close a gap and stay with the group. And other times you're kind of tucked into the group and maybe you're not even pedaling. You're just kind of being sucked along. What you will find with really good athletes like that is they're actually kind of right in the middle. So they need kind of both. They need to be good at both. Another thing that we can pull out now with different types of testing is this thing called fat max. So this is where the wattage where this athlete utilizes fat at the highest level. Did you guys get that, or did I freeze? Sounds like you got it. So
you froze for a sec there, Jesse.
Okay, yeah. So all I was saying is this: we can pull numbers here where we can identify the wattage at which you utilize fat the most. So in this particular testing, they call it your fat max, but this would also line up with like your aerobic threshold or your first ventilatory threshold if you were doing a testing that measured those things. If you're doing an FTP test, this might line up with about 65 to 70% of your FTP. So you can kind of work it backwards. It's not exact, but that just gives you an idea. This is basically just showing where this athlete is utilizing fat at the highest level. Okay. And then likewise, this part here shows well, actually, I'll get into this in a sec. So this carb max number that they can find now, humans, they've identified kind of on a maximum can take in, consume, and digest about 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour at a maximum, So that's like, I was able to do that, but that was one of my little gifts. I also trained my body to be able to do that. Not everybody can do that. Some people are more around 60 grams an hour. If they go any higher, they start to have digestive issues. Like that can be a real problem. But this number here is telling us basically where this athlete is using 90 grams of carbs an hour. And that's sort of suggesting like this would be the maximum wattage they could sustain for an Ironman, let's say. So then, we can pull from here, we can get a whole bunch of different zones. So, I know lots of people have probably had testing. This is one type of test. There's also lab tests. There's FTP tests where we can work backwards and discover some of this. But basically, we can get a pretty clear indication now of when you're producing certain wattages that lines up quite specifically with the amount of carbohydrate you're burning and the amount of fat you're burning. So, for the purpose of this talk, our fat max zone, this is where this athlete burns the most amount of fat, is at about 148 watts. And if I go over here, I can see that this athlete is 40 grams per hour of fat. when they're at 148 watts. Now, it's important to also note that it doesn't mean they're not burning carbohydrate. They're still burning quite a bit of carbohydrate, but it's low enough that it's easy to replace. So this athlete could ride along at 148 watts for, a really long time, but they still need to be replacing carbohydrate or eventually they will bonk. Yes, makes sense? So even though this athlete's in like their most effective fat utilization intensity, they still need to replace carbohydrate or they're going to be in trouble over the long haul. They'll get away with it for a couple hours, maybe even 3 hours at that intensity. But eventually those carbohydrate stores are going to run out and they're going to get into trouble. Another interesting thing to kind of look at with this is how dramatically, as intensity goes up, like how dramatically we go to carbohydrate. So for example, let's say this athlete is in their base zone or zone 2, or, if your aerobic zone, some people call it that, which is a little misleading. Let's call it base. So they're at 160 watts here. They're burning about 60 or 58 grams of carbohydrate. It doesn't take much for them to be like off the charts of carbohydrate burning. So if they go from 160 roughly to 213, which that's a big jump, but doesn't seem like too crazy of a jump. They go from burning about 58 grams of carbs to burning like 187 grams of carbs. So you can see that once we go past a certain threshold, like our body really, really demands carbohydrate as the fuel. Okay. So that's important to know. As intensity goes up, you'll just lean more and more heavily on carbohydrate as your fuel source. Okay, so I'm going to get the other screen back here. Let's see. Okay, so really the purpose of this talk here today is to give you a few strategies on how you can train your body or encourage your body to utilize fat as its fuel source. Because ultimately, if you're going to do half Ironman, marathon, ultra running, you want to be more efficient at grabbing hold of fat as fuel because of all the things we talked about. Primarily, you'll limit the loss of your muscle glycogen. It's easier to replace. And fat has tons of energy, right? It's got more than twice the amount of energy that carbohydrate has. So 4 things. The first is that intensity matters. I'm going to dive into these a little more deeply. Something called pre-depletion, utilizing big gear work on the bike, and carbohydrate restriction. These are 4 ways that we can encourage your body to lean more on fat as its fuel source.
Here, I can't breathe.
Oh.
It's out. I'm just gonna.
Hang on a sec. I'm just gonna throw someone on mute here. Okay. So intensity matters. Now we talked about that a little bit. So when intensity is low, you'll lean more on fat as your fuel source. Feel like a broken record here. I think I've said that a bunch of times. This typically happens at or below about 65% of your aerobic capacity. So again, if you've had testing, this is like that first ventilatory threshold or your zone 2 or your base zone. They kind of lump them all into the same thing. The goal for longer endurance events is to move as fast as possible while utilizing as much fat as possible. So you limit carbohydrate loss and avoid bonking. So really, if you're going to do Ironman, your goal should be to increase the pace you can go while staying in that optimal kind of fat utilization space. So around that 65%. And with training, you can do that. Like one of the most famous stories I've heard, and not everybody on this call will know this athlete, maybe not, but Mark Allen, if you don't know who Mark Allen is, he's like the Roger Federer of the 80s and 90s. He's one of the greatest athletes that ever did Ironman. And the rumor was at the beginning of the year, he would go test himself and he'd run a mile like when he was out of shape. And he would run a mile at that roughly 65%. So he'd have a very specific heart rate that he was using to identify like that zone. And he'd run a mile when he was out of shape. And the rumor is he'd do it in about 7 minutes, which, you know, for lots of people, that's pretty quick. But for him and to win in Kona is not fast at all. And over time, as his body got fitter and more efficient, when he was really ready and winning Kona, he would, at the same heart rate, so the same relative intensity, he'd be running a 5.5-minute mile, which is pretty impressive. Now, I don't know how true that is, but it's probably pretty close, because when he would win Kona, he'd be, you know, he'd run basically I think he was running high 230s for the marathon off the bike. Like he was kind of in the 230s, at least low 240s, which means he's ticking along at, you know, 6.5-minute miles, you know, at the end of an 8-hour day in 40 degrees and humidity, which is pretty impressive. But it also tells us that he's still in that really efficient state of utilizing fat as his fuel source. And so, yeah, basically we can set pretty clear parameters using wattage now, because we have so much data and information that's come in over the years. And power meters are so accurate now, like it's just easy. You know, we have so much information from them. It's really great. So that's the first one, just going back. So intensity matters. The second one, pre-depletion. So basically another little hack or another little trick we can do is we can do a higher intensity workout the day before, or even if you have the luxury of doing 2 workouts in a day, you can do it the morning of and then do another workout later in the day, where it's higher intensity. So higher intensity, we know now, is going to grab hold of carbohydrate and deplete our carbohydrate stores a little more quickly. And then if we follow that up a day later or in the afternoon with a lower intensity workout, one that's in the zone where we're burning fat primarily, it kind of tricks our body, because now we have less carbohydrate to use anyway. So it kind of encourages our body to use fat more readily than it might be if we had our bodies are, our muscle glycogen was full. So we can kind of pre-deplete and then make sure we're at an intensity that's encouraging fat usage anyway, but also we're a little low on carbohydrates. So that encourages us even more, if that makes sense. Does that make sense? Yes? Yep. Yeah, so I think I've covered all that. So the third one, and this is kind of a really trippy one, but kind of cool. So when we're on the bike, if we push a big gear or lower cadence, we use more fast twitch muscle fibers to do that. Torque is higher, so we have fast twitch muscle fibers and slow twitch muscle fibers. Fast twitch fibers really love sugar. They love carbohydrate, which makes sense, right? If we're going to use more fast twitch fibers when we're going faster, when intensity is higher, they grab hold of sugar or carbohydrate more quickly. Okay, so if we go for a long ride, let's say we do a 4-hour bike ride, and in there we do some little sets at a very low RPM. We use more fast twitch fibers, they use more sugar, but we keep the intensity pretty low for the rest of the ride. We're kind of doing the same thing as that pre-depletion. We're doing something that uses carbohydrate more quickly, but then we're doing a long ride and keeping the intensity low, which encourages the body to use more fat. So basically all we're doing is getting rid of some of the carbohydrate that we might more quickly gravitate towards, and saying, hey, you know what, that fuel source isn't as available to you right now, and the intensity is low enough, you need to be using fat more. Let me see if I covered all my points. Yep, pretty much, I think. Yeah. So that's just a little hack, and I'm gonna show you here. This is an example of a pretty specific workout that you can do. So obviously warm up and cool down at either end, but the main set can be as many rounds of something like this as you want. So you spend about 20 minutes at a really low RPM, okay? And you wanna be just above that optimal fat utilization intensity. So first of all, you're using more fast twitch muscle fibers. The intensity is a little bit higher. So guess what? My body's like, okay, now it's chewing through my carbohydrate stores a little more quickly. But it's not super intense. It's not so intense that I'm going to bonk, right? And then I go back, and for the bulk of that hour, if we're breaking it into 20 minutes, 40 minutes, for the bulk of that hour, I just go back to like my base pace and normal RPM, whatever that is for you, say 80 to 90. And that is the intensity where my body likes fat more as a fuel. And then I keep switching back and forth. So I blow myself out of a little more carbohydrate, and then I come back and I say, hey, no, the intensity we're going to do right now is like we're utilizing fat more. Oh, and now guess what? We're jumping over here and we're going to chew through a little bit more carbohydrate. So as the ride goes on, you basically run out of carbohydrate as a fuel source, but it doesn't really matter because the intensity you're going is encouraging you to use fat anyway. So that's another little fun workout or a bit of a hack that you can use to do that. So then the last thing you can do is actually restrict carbohydrate. So you can do the long rides where you make sure your intensity is appropriate. So in that space where you're utilizing fat as fuel primarily, but you can restrict carbohydrate. So even if you're doing those long rides and if you're still, consuming carbohydrate, like tons of it, your body's still going to grab hold of it and use it. But if you restrict it a little bit, then it encourages your body to utilize fat. Now, this is where we have to tread very, very carefully with this stuff. Please do not take this as permission to starve yourself. I'm guilty of this. I've gone down this road just to kind of play around and experiment when I was racing, where we would fast overnight. We wouldn't have breakfast. We'd have coffee. And then we'd try and go and ride for 4 or 5 hours on nothing. And it's just dumb. Like, don't do that. That is not what I'm telling you to do here. What I'm telling you to do is just maybe limit your carbohydrate consumption a little bit. So if you're normally taking in 60 to 90 grams per hour, maybe you take in 40. You take in just enough to meet the demand that your body has at that intensity, rather than like so much that your body is like, oh, that fuel source is readily available to me. I'm going to just quickly go back to these zones here. So if we look here, like a great example would be, okay, I'm going to go out for a ride. I'm going to stay in, what they call here my fat max zone. So around 148 watts. I know, actually, no, let's go to base. Base makes it, yeah. So at base, say I'm like 160 watts. I know that I'm burning through about 58 grams per hour, but I'm still utilizing a lot of fat here. So instead of trying to replace all that, I bring it down a bit to about 40 grams an hour. So I restrict it just a little bit. Again, I'm not starving myself. We're not doing that. We're just restricting a little bit. So, there'll be a net loss of carbohydrate over the 4 or 5 hours, but it won't be so detrimental that I bonk. I'm not going to deplete myself and put myself into a big hole that I can't climb out of, or it takes me 2 or 3 days to climb out of. We don't want you to do that. We're just restricting a little bit. So it just encourages more and more to utilize fat as your fuel source. That makes sense? Let's see here. I think that's all I had. So that's basically it. So our 4 strategies again are making sure your intensity is appropriate. So making sure you're going at an intensity that is encouraging fat usage. To pre-deplete, so maybe do a harder workout the day before your long workout or the morning of. So you go into that workout a little bit depleted, but then you keep your intensity, in the right place to still be utilizing fat. Big gear work or lower cadence work does something similar in that it's going to chew through a little more carbohydrate than you might normally on a long ride. And now you're switching back and going at an intensity that really encourages fat utilization. And then carbohydrate restriction. So, on a 4-hour ride, instead of pounding back, everything you would normally pound back, you're just restricting a little bit, but not starving yourself, just limiting a little bit so it puts more emphasis on fat being your primary fuel source. Yeah, a lot of information. Thomas, how'd you handle that? Was that interesting or like boring?
It was pretty interesting.
Yeah, cool. So how long do you think Thomas is doing a 26-kilometer run, and how long do you think roughly that's going to take you? Any ideas?
Probably 3 to 4 hours.
Yeah. So this is a perfect example of an event where you don't have enough muscle glycogen in your body. You don't have enough carbohydrate in your body to last that long. So you're either going to have to replace it, which is partly what you're going to have to do, or you're going to have to go at an intensity that allows your body to use fat as its primary fuel source, and probably a combination of both, right? So making sure you're going slow enough that your body is, leaning on fat as its fuel, but also having a nutrition strategy to replace the carbohydrate that you're also going to lose. But if the intensity is appropriate, you won't need to consume as much as if you tried to do that really, really hard. Does that make sense? Yeah. Any questions? Anybody sort of like, did that go way over your head, or was that pretty easy to grab hold of? What do you think?
I have a couple questions, Jasper, or Rena, go ahead if you're ready.
No, I'm actually going to say bye because I have a work meeting to go to. So,
Oh, cool. Well,
yeah, that was awesome.
Thanks for jumping on, Rena. And yeah, if you have questions after, just fire them my way.
I will. Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.
Bye.
So Jazzy, just thinking about applying this. So what's it called? The inside test.
Yeah.
I did sign up for that.
Yes.
And I signed up for it right at the time where all the races just got all canceled, and I lost a lot of motivation and everything. So I still have that in my back pocket to do.
Yes.
And based, what you're saying is that test will help establish what the thresholds are and the information that I can then apply to this practice, right?
Right.
So I guess the question would be, I wonder when I should actually do the test.
Yeah.
If part of me thinks I should just wait until we know what the future holds, and then get that baseline.
Yeah.
When I'm going to actually start to train with some structure and purpose again.
Yeah, 100%. Given the nature of things right now, I wouldn't necessarily rush into it because, things aren't going to happen this fall. The States is kind of crazy right now. They just canceled, Kona, right? So I would hold off. I mean, right now, whatever numbers you're using are probably good, because there's not like a really direct thing that you're pointing the training at right now, unless you do have sort of a goal that you're ticking off for the summer. If it's just to stay in shape,
No.
and maybe even be a little playful and a little more organic with your training, and less sort of, pointing the arrow at something direct, then I wouldn't worry. I would wait. Like if you're, if we find out this is all going to clear up and starting January 1st, the world can open up and race again. I don't think that's going to happen either, but let's just say it did, and kind of going back to normal, then, and your training officially is going to start sort of September, October, whenever, then I would do it then, so that you have, as you said, a fresh baseline that allows you to really direct and be specific, for sure. Yeah.
And the other thing I did a bit of reading too before this, just out of my own curiosity in the last several months, and stumbled upon Dan Plews, I think his name is.
Okay. Yeah.
And read up on a lot of his theory, which is similar to what you just went through too, which is good. But the added piece that he had in there was just sort of incorporating, like changing your whole diet essentially. And that was a big mountain for me to climb, just family. And like, if I lived by myself, that'd be one thing, but
yeah,
I think my training's a pain in the butt enough for the family, let alone changing my whole diet. So
is his philosophy like kind of taking carbohydrate out of the diet completely? Is that?
it's all about healthy fats, right? And
Okay. Yeah.
a lot of the theory is very similar to what you went through, finding your thresholds, burning fat as fuel, and then you sort of adapt your body over time, over several weeks, whatever it was.
Yeah.
So that you're a fat burning machine, I think was the term. And then when you get into closer to race time and in a race, when you're adding carbohydrates, like your body is really responding as well, right? And it's not totally cutting the carbs out, but it's just choosing high fat, low carb food sources in your daily life, which sounds totally counterintuitive to what you would typically think of in this kind of world.
Yeah, I'm a little hesitant to go down that road. I mean, I can understand the idea behind it. There's definitely people in the nutrition space that are far smarter than I am in that regard. But the reason I'm hesitant is because I think people take sort of diet stuff like that a little bit too far. And the reality is, as an endurance athlete, even if you're doing Ironman, you're just chewing through carbohydrate. Like, you cannot avoid it. Even when you're at that first threshold, you're still like utilizing carbohydrate. You can't not. So I think what people do is they're like, oh, I'm gonna maybe go down this path and I eat a high fat, no or low carb diet, and they kind of dig a little bit of a hole and don't realize that their bodies still have a demand for carbohydrate. And so that would be the only caution I would throw out there. I mean, I think I've heard his name before, and I think he's probably like, really well read and a super smart dude about it. So I might dive in a little bit more just to see what he has to say, for sure. But my own personal thing is like just to, eat a pretty balanced diet, and then use maybe training hacks to get you leaning a little more heavily on that, or understanding that you can increase the pace or the wattage that you're going at and still be at the same relative intensity. So there's training strategies that you can use that will basically move those threshold numbers up. So your relative intensity is still the same. You're still at, say, 65% or whatever you want to call it. But now instead of pushing 160 watts, you're pushing 180 watts. So the effective result's still the same. So yeah, I'll dive in a little bit to what he said and maybe comment a little further.
Yeah, he's really it was interesting. It was my first sort of dive into this.
Yeah.
And I was going down a rabbit hole of, like many of us you get so focused on this kind of stuff, and then you realize you're an age group athlete, you're not a pro. Settle down a bit. But he had a couple, I think he's done a couple podcasts with what's the guy's name, Triathlon Terran.
Oh yeah, okay.
On walks and stuff, and anyway, it was super interesting, really engaging guy, and a lot of the same theory that you talked about here. So it's really helpful. Yeah,
cool. And I was gonna say, like, I'm not opposed to that methodology either. I think you have to be a little bit careful with it. I think what happens typically is that carbohydrate, in our diets is just so easy. It's so easy to get sugar and carbohydrate. And the problem with that is that we way overdo that more than anything. And so I'm all in favor of a pullback in our consumption of, especially refined sugars and carbohydrates that aren't necessarily good for us.
Yeah.
So, and all you need to do is go down the grocery store aisles, pick up any package of anything, and there's sugar in everything. So I'm in favor of like skewing us away from that type of eating. And hey, my carbohydrate sources are now going to be, slower carbohydrates, maybe like where, well, not fruit, because not all fruit is created equal either, but there are fruits with lower glycemic indexes that are just a little bit slower. Focusing on stuff, our carbohydrate sources are not all created equal. And too often we lean on the really crappy types of carbohydrate because it's quick and easy and cheap. So being more mindful of where am I getting my other, food sources from. So really good fats, like you said, good proteins. Yeah, I'm in favor of sort of a revamp in general of how we eat. The caution I would have is that I think people take it too far, and now they're like, carbohydrates out for good. But we're in the sports we burn carbohydrate every day. Even if your intensity is low, you are still burning carbohydrate. So you need to replace it somehow, or you can kind of dig a bit of a hole. So, but I'll go read. I've heard his name, and I'm sure he's got some really awesome stuff to say. So I'll dive.
Yeah, no, it's consistent with what you're saying. Just it's a business, I think. So
totally, yeah. No, but I'm still interested. Be good. Cool. Anybody else got a question to throw at me?
Hey, Jazz.
Yeah.
Question for you. With all the data and stuff, and the power meters that are so accurate, how do you translate some of this stuff to running where we don't have those same kind of metrics? Does it go back to heart rate intensity levels? Because if my heart rate running will get higher than I go on a bike unless I'm absolutely sprinting as hard as I can. I don't understand that, but I was just wondering how you apply some of this stuff to your running workouts, or how you fine tune this running versus biking, where you can dial in pretty easily with the meters that are out there.
Yeah, that's a great question. So a couple things on that. The first is that they are as running power meters become more effective, more accurate, more mainstream. I mean, there are a few out there, but they're not totally awesome yet. They're not totally dialed, but they'll get there. So eventually we'll have power metrics for running that are really on point and probably very similar to the accuracy we get on a bike power meter. And I think that'll be a game changer for this type of stuff. But without that, then we are just still measuring intensity, and heart rate is a great way to do that. Now, the limitation to heart rate, unfortunately, is it's highly affected by other things. So if it's hot and your core body temperature is up, then heart rate's going to be perhaps misleadingly up. If you're sick, your heart rate can be kind of affected by that. Heart rate's just a bit fluky, but by and large, I think it's still a really great measure. And in fact, I think people should use both. So if you're on a bike and you have power meter, you should also use heart rate, because it gives us some clues, right? It tells us stuff. Well, let's say, wattage is wattage. It's the purest measure of effort on a bike. It's awesome. It doesn't care if it's hot. It doesn't care if it's cold. It doesn't care if it's windy. It doesn't care about any of that stuff. It's like, how hard are you pushing on the pedals? But heart rate, if we can line it up, and for the most part, they will line up. But if they're not, they might tell us something. So let's say, I'm pushing 150 watts and my heart rate that should line up with that is like 140 heart rate. Like that's where it should line up. The testing kind of tells me that that's where it should be. But let's say I'm doing 150 watts and now my heart rate is like 160. And it's like, and maybe you're feeling a little funny. I mean, that might tell us something. It might tell us that you're, that it's hot. It might tell us that you're sick. It might tell us some other clue. But again, I think that's the rare case. Most of the time, it's going to line up pretty closely. So we can use heart rate. We can use pace on running. But the thing with pace is that all other factors have to be sort of negated. So pace becomes a bit useless if you're running up and down hills. Pace becomes a bit useless maybe if the terrain is different. So I'm off-road. I basically just trail run right now, and then, you know, I'll run 10K will take me like an hour and 15 minutes sometimes. So pace is totally useless in the trails, right? Like, whereas on the road, it might take me like 40 minutes or something. So yeah. Anyway, I'm not really answering your question other than to say that yes, heart rate is still a really effective way to get to roughly the same place. And so don't not use it. Just know that it's highly variable and quite affected by other things. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And the follow-up question then would be, does this come into play in your swim workouts too then?
Like utilizing fat as fuel?
Yeah.
Swimming?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's kind of I don't know if I really thought about that before coming into here. Swim workouts typically are 45 to 90 minutes would be my guess for most people. You're not really in any danger of running out of carbohydrate stores. If you're with a master's group, you're kind of at the mercy of what they're going to give you. And usually that is a warm up and then a main set of like 10 times 100 or 5 times 200 or whatever wacky set you're doing. And yeah, you're probably going to be going at intensities that do not utilize fat as fuel as effectively as if you were just doing it on your own. But that's kind of swim training. Swim training in a pool with a group is its own special animal, which I think is actually really good. It's effective. What I would say is that, you know, if you're going to get ready for Ironman, you should develop the ability to swim for like an hour or an hour 10 or 15 straight, because that's ultimately what you're going to do in the race. And that intensity, if you're an age grouper and your goal is basically to get from start to finish the quickest, then yeah, you should probably settle in at a pace that allows you to be the most efficient with your fuel sources, because it's the start of the day. So you don't want to get out of the water in an hour 15 or whatever the swim time is going to be completely depleted of your glycogen stores. That would not be a great strategy, because then you're kind of just playing catch up all day. However, what I will say is if you're a pro athlete, in most races now, especially Kona, that kind of goes out the window, because if you lose that group early on, you're really in your day is pretty much done. Like they kind of go out pretty hard right from the start. Like it's sort of a different strategy they have to dive into. But in your case specifically, I would I would take some stock on what that intensity feels like, where you can be around that first threshold, settle in there and try and get as fast as you can there. I think that's a great strategy.
And that's consistent with my experience, because over the years I've always done these long swims for the hour, 75 minutes, just straight, whether it be open water or the pool.
Yeah.
And I've just found them, they're just a good endurance workout. I found that they give you an idea when you're in that horizontal position for 75 minutes, how's your body reacting to it? And then just those recovery swims that you've had in the programs and stuff is, I found those just awesome. I couldn't believe how valuable I found them to be.
Yeah.
Totally. So it's just interesting. And just a comment on Chris talking about the guy he was listening to. I take away from all these, and I've done a lot of reading like you, Chris, and listening to some of these things. It seems to me that where it all goes is that people are making the ones that are finding success in these different things. They've just been able to find a way to turn their body into a fat burning machine very efficiently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But to be clear, the important thing to remember is it's all relative intensity. So the goal really is to be moving as fast as you possibly can, still at your at the relative intensity. So like that example I used with Gallon is as you get fitter, if you're training properly, you're basically you're going the same intensity, you're just moving way more quickly. You can't fight the physiology. Like when you go past certain thresholds, you just start utilizing different fuel sources. You cannot change that. But what you can change is the pace you're going at those same relative intensities. That makes sense?
Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've got a
Thanks,
question
man.
here. I'm gonna jump in, and this is my buddy Grant Bullington. I can't actually believe he's on here. It's really cool. He doesn't have his camera on, but I'm gonna say hi. Nice to see you, dude. He's got a great question. He said, heard you loud and clear on the 4-hour coffee rides. So I think he's referring to the ones where I said, I fast all night, don't eat in the morning, have a coffee, and then just basically ride with no food, which I don't necessarily think is an awesome idea. I got myself into a bit of trouble with those.
That's how I go to work.
Awesome.
Just coffee.
Just coffee. But he says, what's your stance on 60 to 90 minute zone 2 coffee rides? So I think what he's asking is, okay, so a little bit shorter. So maybe you're not you're not going to get yourself into as much trouble. Well, yeah, I think that's actually probably pretty effective. When we come off of a night of sleep, our body is actually in a really efficient state. Like we are utilizing fat as fuel primarily, not exclusively, but primarily. And so if we have coffee, one of the neat things about coffee is it helps us metabolize fatty acids, the caffeine does. So if you get up in the morning, you have a coffee, and then you head out for 60 to 90 minutes in zone 2, what he's calling zone 2, or basically at or below the threshold where we utilize fat. Yeah, I think that's like really effective. And in fact, that's how I do most of my long runs. I actually can't eat before a long run because I think the introduction of carbohydrate tricks my body into thinking I have enough, but I've basically been fasting all night, so I'm a little bit low. And I get super weird, like I feel like absolute garbage. But if I get up, have a coffee, and then go running, as long as I'm not, trying to do a tempo run or a hard 10K, like if I'm just going for a run, I can run for like 2+ hours without any issue. And I usually feel incredible. And I think it's because my body is just like in such a efficient state. So hopefully that kind of answered your question there, Grant. But he has a follow-up, and he says, if we can't do 2 workouts in a day, is it a trick to have the first hour of a 4-hour ride be higher intensity and then settle into endurance pacing for the remaining 3 hours? So that's actually a really good question. And I think that probably lines up with that workout example that I gave, where you're going back and forth between that lower RPM stuff, which burns through carbohydrate a little bit quicker, and then settling in at the easier pace with normal RPM, which leans more on fat. So I would say that, yeah, that I haven't never really thought of that as a strategy, but it might probably work about the same. So what he's saying, if I'm going to do a 4-hour ride, what if I do the warm up and then maybe do the first hour at a higher intensity, so I kind of deplete my carbohydrate stores a little more quickly, and then for the remainder of that ride I settle in to a pace that encourages fat burning? I would say, yeah, I probably would do something similar, because you're chewing through carbohydrates, so it's not as readily available, and I'm going to spend the remainder of the ride leaning more on fat. What I would say, the caution I would say, is don't ever put yourself in a position where you are going to bonk, because it's not really good for you. Like it takes a long time to recover from that. The ride will be miserable. You probably won't produce as much wattage as you should, which then the training effect's not as great. So in the example he gave, first hour harder, then 3 hours, more in my zone 2 or my, around that first threshold, I would still consume carbohydrate, but maybe just restrict a bit. So, if I need 60 grams an hour, maybe I'm just doing 40. So I'm not going to bonk, but I'm certainly going to encourage my body to be more on utilizing fat, if that makes sense. That's a great question, though. That's a neat little hack too that might be effective. So hopefully that answered your question. Yeah, you bet. Thanks, Grant. Anybody else got a question? Nope. Okay, well, maybe we'll wrap it up there. Thanks so much for jumping on. And if you have follow-up questions at all, like definitely email me or, message us on Instagram or wherever. And we'll, Grant's just saying I'm late for a work web call. Really helpful. Right on, buddy. Thanks for jumping on there. Anyway, thanks for joining us, and yeah, great to see everybody again. This will be up as a recording again, so if you want to review it, you can see it in a bit. Cool.
Awesome.
Great.
Right on, you
Thank
guys.
you.
Thanks for coming. Yeah.
Have a good day, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
See ya.
See ya.
Bye.
See ya, Thomas. See you guys.